Good evening, everybody. This is Mike Aiken, Chair of the Roman Roads Research Association. Welcome to tonight's talk. I see there's one or two people still coming in, so we'll just give it a minute or two, although it's slowing down. So I'll just waffle slowly for once. I'm expecting comments on the chat on that straight away. Okay. Right, tonight we welcome Ian Jackson, who is a geologist, used to work for the British Geological Survey. Having tried to glean all sorts of stuff on him online, pretty much all I can find out is he's a geologist, likes working outdoors, and the important thing apparently is that he lives on the Staingate. You'll be aware that one of our regular backroom team, you should probably ask Susan, she's not with us this evening, thought she lived on the Staingate until we had to let her down rather gently that actually the Staingate was a few yards away. Well, Ian's trumped her because he does, so I'm told. Maybe he'll tell us something about that in the talk. Anyway, before we go any further, a little bit of housekeeping for anybody who's new. If you want to put any questions to Ian during his talk, please use the chat function, but this is important. We're going to do it slightly differently today. If you can just put question in capitals at the beginning of it, then it's easy for our team to spot the question and pass it on to me. Obviously, I put the questions to Ian at the end. Second thing, the talk is being recorded, so if you can all make sure you keep yourselves muted and your videos turned off. I did try and check the settings, so nobody should be able to draw on the screen, but just in case, if you do have that little pen-shaped symbol on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, please don't fiddle with it because that will draw lines. It shouldn't be there. I think I've fixed that one, fingers crossed. Okay, and looking at the numbers, I think that's just about it. So are you there, Ian?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay?
I can, so I assume everybody else can. And with that, I think I'll just pass over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Dave Armstrong, for coaching me through and inviting me, and to everybody else for listening to a geologist for the next 3 hours. I If any of you decide, I can't see whether you're falling asleep or not, but if you want to be wise after the event and not listen to the rest of the talk, this is the conclusions. The first thing I should say is that this is very much a geologist perspective on how the Romans exploited the landscape and the resources. But I'm going to argue that they they used the landscape a lot and very wisely, and that rocks and geology had a profound influence on the decisions they took about their infrastructure, the walls, the vallum, the roads, their routeways, and the materials that they used to build not only their infrastructure but also most of their possessions. And I guess the slightly more controversial bit is that if the archaeological domain and the geological domain were less siloed and would be prepared to spend more time collaborating, then my science can help validate and constrain archaeological and historical work, and at the same time can reveal some new areas that would enrich the stories and the conclusions that are developed. So for the next 40 minutes, I'd like to preface it all with some words on archaeology and geology, because I've been working with archaeologists and published 2 books in the last few years about the influence of geology on the Romans, but also the influence of geology on prehistoric peoples. And then, if you'll forgive me, I hope I'm not going to patronize. I know there's at least one person in your group who used to work for British Geological Survey, but he wasn't a geologist. No doubt he absorbed a lot in his career, but I'd like to put us all on the same page by a 2-minute little introduction to the bare essentials of geology. And then the core of the talk is about what rocks did for the Romans, their infrastructure and the exploitations of natural resources. So Mike told you a little bit about me. This is more detail. I joined BGS in '73. For the first 19 years or so, I was an honest geologist, and I worked in the field with a hammer and made geological maps of the UK, mostly in the north. I meddled with early spatial computing in the 80s, and that was before the days of GIS and ArcInfo, but ultimately became responsible for BGS's digital information program, which was essentially converting all its analog data and materials into digital forms. As a result of that, I guess I climbed the greasy pole and became information director, and then director of operations director of British Geological Survey, and I also was led an initiative for the geological surveys of the world to make their data available on the web. And I retired in 2011, and in the last few years I've become a writer of rock books. I discovered that despite its best efforts, British Geological Survey were not engaging with people outside the geological bubble, either professional or amateur, and not a lot of people actually understood what rocks are about and why they were relevant. So that's why I guess you're having the talk today. So if I can move on to archaeology and geology, we both share curiosity about the past. We just do it on vastly different timescales, but we both look beneath the surface of the ground, and our interests overlap quite a great deal. But it's not so much overlap, I've discovered, as no man's land. There's quite a lot of space that we just don't cover, each of us. We share the same modus operandi. We observe, we survey, we measure in the field and in the laboratory, on different scales perhaps, but nonetheless we do those things. And the landscape and its rocks and its deposits are essential components of that for each of us.
Ian, can I just butt in for a second? Can you possibly lean forward closer to the microphone? We're
Yeah,
getting a lot
sure.
of comments that people can't hear you.
Okay, is that any better?
Yes, it is. I
Yeah,
hope so.
I'm apologies for that. Dave did remind me. I didn't appreciate that my mic was quite as weak as it is. So we both have an all-consuming interest in stones and ores and things that are made from the metals of those ores. We share a vocabulary. We use lots of terms: stratigraphy, provenance. It goes on and on and on. We use, just as you do, I guess, LiDAR, to look at the terrain and look in more detail than we've ever done before, and more precision, both in X, Y, and Z. And we use the same techniques, geophysics and geochemistry. We have an interest in bones. From the geological side, that's because all our bones and teeth absorb to some degree through our intake of water, the chemicals, the geochemicals that are present in the rocks. And you don't get far in isotope geochemistry unless you have some context. In other words, you can analyze the bones and the teeth and get their chemical composition, but unless you have a geological map to understand where those chemicals are most prevalent, then you have nowhere to put your contextualize your analysis. That's the Grand Canyon. Not all UK geology is quite like the Grand Canyon. It's mostly covered by earth and turf and soil and urban and roads. And we're both interpretive sciences. Our evidence is rarely complete. It's mostly in bits and pieces. It's a lot of different sub-disciplines, and it can be very subtle. And it's important to realize that both geology and archaeology are the best estimates of the experts that do it. They're never fact. So fundamentally, science is not a destination, it's a journey. But geology is a science, and it's focused on rocks and earth on that physical landscape at a variety of scales, from the global, some might say even planetary, to the intensely local, such as that landslide that has happened in New Zealand overnight. We differ in terms of timescales too. So there's a geological timescale on the left of your screen, and as an archaeological timescale of sorts on the right hand side. You don't really have to. I always said when I left work, I'd never use the expression. You probably won't be able to read the writing on this slide, but I'm doing now. But you really don't need to read the writing on this slide. The salient facts are that geology looks at the last 4.6 billion years, of which 485 million are in the north of England, and archaeology looks at 2.6 million years. So let's put that in context. There's the archaeological timescale, and there's the geological timescale. So we have quite a difference in scope, and you might argue a difference in resolution and detail as well. I think we differ in data. For those of you familiar with geology, I don't know to what extent you consult geological maps when you're doing your research. I would hope you would, and I would hope you would consult the most detailed ones, which are 1 to 10,000 scale. But the one thing that the UK is fortunate is that there is systematic and comprehensive coverage of all of the UK's geology at 1 to 10,000 scale, sometimes in multiple editions. Some places have been mapped 4 times. No, the rocks don't change, but the amount of information we have and the development of the science means that the disposition of the rock changes. And we can get very detailed. So that's a piece of core, looking at a water contamination study, and it'll be studied in millimetric resolution. If I move over to archaeology, I pinched that map from somewhere, but it kind of shows you the sporadic nature of the beast. It's very detailed, but there is no national context. That means you're joining dots without any great understanding of what's between those dots. And if the dots are far apart, then the interpretation is, well, conjecture and inference. But here's maybe the biggest difference between the two. We're lucky, for the most part, as geologists, as a science, we study the rocks. Archaeology attempts to bond both science and the humanities, sociology as well. And that is a really hard ask, because the more, well, humans are a very volatile variable in the equation, and that results inevitably in far more narratives appearing. I would say that geologists often envy archaeology because they are that much more creative and the subject is that much more fascinating. But at the same time, we can get quite frustrated by the extent to which, shall we say, a few facts are developed into narratives that seem less well constrained than they should be, and often the confidence levels are not quoted with the inferences. There is that tension. So here's a quick look over 485 million years. So before I move on to the core of the talk, go back. Before I move on to the core of the talk, what I'm essentially trying to persuade you is that rocks are and were essential to the Romans and their prehistoric forebears. And lest you think we're any different, I will probably challenge you to name anything in your room that hasn't been either produced because of a rock or is a resource that's been exploited from rocks. Up the left-hand side of the screen, I hope, was a list of things that the Romans depended on the geology of the UK for. And I haven't got time to go through all 50 that are in the book, but I'm hoping by the end of this that I might have persuaded you to go out and buy the book so you can look at the other 35. And I look forward to a blip in sales. And what I should say is that the books all support charities, so you're not putting money in my pocket. So let's have a look at a bit of the way geology influenced the evidence for some of the things I've been saying. What you see in that colourful strip is the geology of a strip of northern England in the Hadrian's Wall corridor. You can see the wall in black with the dots on it, and the important bit of this, the rest of that is geological units: limestone, sandstone, coal measures. The red bit is the Winsill quartz dolerite, and the picture in the right hand side, and I'm sure many of you have been, is Peel Crags seen from Steel Rig on Hadrian's Wall, which is that dolerite, a 30-metre natural cliff. And all Hadrian had to do was add 4.5 metres of sandstone wall on top. He had a natural barrier already. And David Breeze and Eric Grafstahl, so not geologists, already determined that the line of Hadrian's Wall was dictated by that outcrop of Winsill, that 20 to 30 metre north-facing escarpment. After they decided they were going to cross from the Solway to the Tyne, they deduced that the line of the Winsill was the controlling factor in that topography, and the east and west limbs from the Winsill to the respective coasts are simply subservient. They stay on higher, drier ground, away from water if they can, and the Winsill is the controlling factor. It gave natural strategic advantage. It's impossible to understate just how significant the Winsill is in Northumberland, certainly, and Cumbria's landscape and its economies. So those of you who've had the pleasure of visiting Northumberland, apart from coming to the Wall, will probably have been to Bamborough, you may have been to Holy Island, you may have been to the Farne Islands, and all of those things are outcrops of the Winsill. So without it, they would be, the origin of Christianity in the UK would perhaps not be in Northumberland, and neither would all the barons and the castles in Northumberland. So I think we can give that one a tick to geology. It was instrumental in the location of some pretty important bits of history. A slightly more complex one, the map on the top. The red is the same Winsill in the central sector. The brown pieces are peat deposits. Both of these are taken from geological maps. The little dotted line on the red is the course of the wall, and the dashed line is a structure called the vallum, which I'm pretty sure all of you know. Its function is not quite well understood, but it consists of a 6-metre wide ditch and 2 ramparts on either side, and you can probably see that in the drone image. Usually the vallum, which may or may not be the limit of the military zone, until you get to the Winsill outcrop, the vallum and the wall are like best buddies. They stay close to each other, parallel, they're never far apart, and that's the same at the western end, roughly after Greenhead. They parallel each other. But in this central sector, the vallum deviates quite a lot. And when you put it on a geological map, you can see exactly why that probably is. The vallum avoids the wind sill. After all, the vallum is not a wall, it's a ditch. And if you're going to dig through something as hard as dolerite, and they still use explosives in the quarries today, and you've probably been to the four wall ditch at Limestone Corner, that's a misnomer, it's Windsill Corner. They struggled, the Romans struggled to break through it. So they avoided it. They also avoided all the peat bogs, which in Roman times could well have been waterlogged lakes, cars. For obvious reasons, the sides would have collapsed, and the water table was so high it would have flooded anyway. So you can see the way the vallum threads its way through those two difficult pieces of geology, and basically it's recognition that the Roman surveyors, the legionary surveyors, exploratores, were fairly capable geologists with a good understanding of the landscape, not only the Wyn in terms of its prominence and advantage for positioning of the wall, but also its disadvantages from driving through the vallum. The wall wasn't always stone in its first incarnation, as you probably know better than me. By the time you get near Bird Oswald, it changed to be built of turf. That's actually not right. Although it was turf, a lot of it was earth and glacial deposits beneath that. The grass bits bound it together. And why is that? Well, if you look at the bottom map, it's a very crude map showing the thickness of glacial deposits, the thickness of the alluvium and glacial material from about 20,000 years ago to now. The lighter colours are where the bedrock is close to the surface and those glacial deposits are thin. In other words, where the sandstone is near the surface that you could open quarries in. The darker areas are where those glacial deposits get thick. And when I say thick, I mean could be up to 40 meters. So you have to go a long way to open your little sandstone quarry to find the building material for a stone wall. And I don't think it's a coincidence that at roughly the point of Willeford Bridge on the Irthing, which is where that photograph of the glacial deposits over the river with bedrock at the bottom, at that point and westwards of that point, the initial incarnation of the wall was earth and turf and not stone. While we're on the subject of foundations and the Roman understanding of geology, this image is just to the west, not so many hundreds of meters from Segedunum Roman fort in Wallsend. And initially the wall was designed to go to Newcastle, and the final 3 kilometres was finished at a slightly later date. And it almost seems as though they didn't pay quite as much attention to what the foundation conditions were in that area of the wall, that piece of the wall. They did seem to understand that they were difficult foundations because they built a double or even triple strength foundation for the wall, but it nonetheless fell down at least 4 times contemporaneously. In Roman times, it collapsed and leant forward. And the reason that it collapsed is not because of water behind it, which is what the archaeological explanation was. If this thing had been built on rock, no amount of water would have knocked it down. We're talking about a very small stream. It fell because it's built on top of very weak laminated glacial clays with an incredibly low shear strength. So those of you who are based in the northeast who've been frustrated by how long it's taken to finish the overpass just to the north and west of the Angel of the North might like to know that there's probably about 30 or 40 meters of these laminated clays. They result, their deposits into a glacial lake about 18,000 years ago, 20 to 18,000 years ago. They're the fine seasonal clays that fill up glacial lakes even today in Canada and Switzerland and the Arctic North. The trouble is these laminations, especially when water gets into them, they they become incredibly weak and they slip, which is why that interchange cost goodness knows how many million pounds, and how why it took them so long. And if you've ever noticed, if you know the Northeast, there's a place called Team Valley, which is a retail park and trading estate. And there aren't many buildings that are heavy loads. They're all lightweight structures and very low. And it's simply because of these laminated clays. Well, the Romans fell foul of them too. My single solitary road slide, and I am sorry, um, but I hope the rest of the talk is relevant to you. So this is a piece of the main road in Caerstopitum, Corbridge Roman town. I know it's got a different name now, it begins with a C, but I'm having a senior moment. It's built of river cobbles from the Tyne, gathered from the Tyne. But the one thing that I discovered when researching the materials that the road is built of, the Staingate in this case, when there were road excavations further west, where the road crossed specific rock types, be they limestone or sandstone, the Romans were incredibly pragmatic. They used whatever building material was to hand, and they also used sand and gravel as a fill, as an aggregate fill inside the lithic clasts. But they did use sandstone as the curbs as well. So there's a principle of least effort going on here, which seems to endure and show the pragmatism of the builders of not only the roads but also the infrastructure. But one of the things they used most, even when they rebuilt the wall, the turf wall, and continued in stone all the way to Carlisle and Bowness and Solway, they used sandstone. In the east, that would be Carboniferous sandstone, and in the west, it would be Perma-Triassic sandstone. And you can see that division most clearly if you ever go to a place called Lanercost Priory, which is built with robbed stone from the wall. And it's a 50-50 blend of both these stones. Some are red-brown, they're Perma-Triassic, so they're younger than the grey-brown Carboniferous rocks of the east. I'll go back. One of the interesting things is that archaeologists they aspire to understanding where the stones in the wall or the buildings, which quarry they come from, where were they specifically sourced. And sometimes they've spent quite a large amount of money attempting to provenance those stones, and I'm afraid it's not possible. And the reason for that is the origin, the environment that both these sets of sandstones were deposited in 330 million years ago in the Carboniferous, and 250 million years ago with the Perma-Trias. In the Carboniferous, you're looking at massive rivers flowing from the north, working and reworking billions of tons of sand. And I'm really not talking about rivers like the Thames or the Tyne. I'm talking about the Brahmaputra or the Amazon. So huge rivers flowing across a plain, braiding, anastomosing, mixing the deposits, reworking them. So there is rarely anything unique about Carboniferous sandstones, the grey-brown stuff. The Perma-Triassic paleo environment was one of deserts with transient lakes and rivers. We were on the equator at the time of the Carboniferous. We were about 10 degrees north by the time of the Perma-Triassic, so equivalent to Oman. And again, we have billions of tons of red-brown sand, worked and reworked by wind and rivers and lakes, and there is no geochemical or physical difference in the sandstones that can be detected either by microscopic or geochemical analysis. It is in very, very special circumstances possible, but you have to have local proximity and a really different sort of stone. So at Vindolanda it has been, but in most of the rest of the length of the wall it is not. what do you? I discovered, I didn't know, but there is no consensus on what held the wall together. In in some places and at some times, the the inner and outer leaf, the northern and southern leaves were bonded with mortar. Sometimes the rubble interior was bonded with mortar, sometimes it was bonded with trampled clay, sometimes the walls looked to have been left dry. But ultimately, they were all mortared. And the mortar at that time was lime mortar, so somewhere they needed to quarry limestone and they needed to burn it in order to produce lime, in order to produce quicklime, in order to produce mortar. But only three kilns, definite kilns, have been found. This one is near Housesteads in Nagburn. It's a running kiln, so it was designed to take the limestone from an outcrop nearby and chunk it up and then burn it with either charcoal or coal and produce mortar. There's another one at a place called High Rochester, which is on the A68, and they discovered that about 3 years ago, and another at Vindolanda. But other than that, we don't know where all the kilns were, and yet they must have used millions of tons of lime to ultimately build the wall, and not only build the wall, but all of the forts and buildings, and all of the internal white rendering, which seems to have been standard to many of the buildings, but not necessarily the wall itself. So where were they getting the lime? Was it just that they were really practical and they opened up what are called clamp kilns, which is a 2 by 3 meter hole in the ground in which you burn the lime in that pit and use it in a very coarse and crude way. Nobody's discovered a huge Roman lime kiln, and that wouldn't be logical because, like most bulk minerals, it's much more efficient to take volume out of the system so that you're transporting the end product the shortest distance possible. So it's logical that the kilns were as near possible the point of use. The I guess the research I did for the books led to more questions than answers, and I'm moving on to iron and metals, and you will know that the Romans were extensive users of iron, both in their armor and their weapons and their tools and their utensils. And but the question is, where did they get the iron from? And if you ask archaeologists along the wall, the answer is often, well, they used bog iron. And I don't know how many of you know what bog iron is, but most of you will have seen red, brown iron oxide, sometimes floating out of slag heaps or percolating into rivers where there are iron deposits nearby. Well, bog iron is that fluid being taken up by the roots of plants in bogs and swamps and flocculating around those roots and then solidifying to form iron pan. And the theory is that Romans and Iron Age people before them would use prods and find out where the iron pan is and then harvest it. It all sounds very sensible until you ask the archaeologist the question, so can you take me to see a bog iron place, please? To which the answer is, well, of course not, because we've drained all the bogs, so there aren't any. And it, it, it's a bit of a conundrum because bog iron is at best an incredibly variable resource and it's really low quality. And there's another factor, and that is Northumberland and Cumbria are incredibly rich in primary geological iron ores. So the top left picture is a siderite nodule from 300 metres, from an 18th century ironstone working 300 metres north of Vindolanda. And on the top right is a hematite vein, bright red, very obvious. Both have high specific gravity. And that's near Boot in Eskdale, so not so far from Hardknott Fort and not a million miles away from Ravenglass. And the Little Ratty Railway, which some of you may have been on, was initially put in place in the 19th, 20th centuries to export hematite from those mines near Boot in Eskdale down to the coast. So we're not short of primary ores that are high quality, higher grade than but we have no evidence of where the Romans sourced their iron. What we what what is sometimes said is, well, they imported it from the Weald or Northamptonshire or the Forest of Dean, where we have definite evidence of Roman exploitation of iron reserves. Well, that might be true, but the ores in the Forest of Dean and Northamptonshire are siderite, and we've got just as good ores in Northumberland. Why would you do that? Especially, why would you do it when we know that Iron Age people and the Romans were really, really good at understanding the landscape and knowing where its resources were? Surely they would have seen these things, but we still don't have definitive evidence that they were used. And when I mean definitive, I mean finding a wooden shovel in a mine. So lead, that's a piece of galena, lead sulfide. Something that was exceedingly popular in the Roman period. It was their plastic. They used it for pipes, for coffins, for vessels, for slingshots, for makeup, and many more things. And like iron, the circumstantial evidence for the use of a mining of lead, the processes of lead in the north of England, especially in the North Pennines, is really, really overwhelming. But we have yet to find a shovel or a Roman shoe or evidence of a Roman lead mine here. There are sometimes things there was one in Botchergate in Carlisle that was seen to be thought to be a Roman smelter, and it looks to have all of those signs. And it could have been smelting lead from Colbeck Fells, from the Lake District, as well as the North Pennines. But we don't know whether they were mining lead here, or were they bringing it from further south, from in Cheshire or from Yorkshire. There's all sorts of circumstantial evidence, but no prima facie evidence. Even less is there any evidence for the Romans being seduced here by the prospect of silver. If I give you some figures, I think in the two biggest mining companies over a century produced in the 19th, 20th century produced 1.5 million tons of lead metal from the North Pennines. Only 1,500 tons of silver was produced in that same period. And that was taken out of the lead because silver in lead reduces its malleability and quality. And the cost of the cupellation, which is the process to take the silver out, would just about been paid for by the value of that silver. So I'm not sure, although there's quite a lot of historic assertion based on Quaker and tax records that the North Pennines are silver rich. To a geologist or mineralogist, they're not. They're silver poor. Copper, something that's associated with lead in ores and present in the hills of the Pennines and in the Lake District, Coniston, Colbeck Fells. There are rich ores in northwest Yorkshire, so near Scotch Corner, Middleton Tyas, near Stanwick Fort, the Iron Age Oppidum. What you see, the ores are so rich there that they're 60% copper, which is incredible. But we don't have evidence of Roman copper mines. What we have is evidence of copper in the rocks, and we have evidence of them continuing to use copper alloy, or used to be bronze, just as much as they used iron. And so we're left with a question: did they import it from known Roman copper mines in near Llandudno on the Great Orme, or in Cheshire, or even from Ireland, or were they mining and processing copper here? It's it's virtually impossible for them not to have been aware of the existence of copper. Bronze Age people were aware of it. It's bright green or blue. It's really evident on the surface. And they were getting their copper from somewhere too. But maybe it's a level of proof that geology demands that is more like a criminal than a civil prosecution, but we're not convinced that we can definitively say that the Romans were mining and processing copper in all lead or iron in the two northern counties of England, as much as the circumstantial evidence points to that. One of the things we do know that they were using is coal, and we're not short of coal either in Northumberland or in Durham or in Cumbria. Um, what's in a name? It's called the Carboniferous because of the coal, and we know that there were coal storage bunkers at places like in Western Newcastle, in Benwell. We know that there are coal storage bunkers in forts like Housesteads. We find the remnants of coal usage in places like Vindolanda or the fort at South Shields, Arbea. They're coal stores. Sometimes you find them in braziers that have fallen over. And but where was it mined? And yet again, coal, like other minerals, later mining almost always erases the evidence of earlier mining. So in a way, you wouldn't expect to find the Roman mining. But one of the things that is good about coal, and that goes back to the fact that we depended on it as a country prior to 1980, was for 60 or 70 years, the NCB and British Coal actually kept a database of the plant spores that are found in coals. So coal is a product of organic debris, plants and swamp plants being compressed, and the carbon in there, and them ultimately becoming coal. But all those plants had what was the equivalent of pollen, really. It's not, because the plants were primitive, so they have spores. And all those spores have different shapes, and their shapes evolved with time. And the coal board needed to know the quality of the coal, or which was the coal seam, because they varied in thermal productivity. And they found that they could tell which coal definitively by the pollens that were in them. So we've got this incredible contextual database of coal spores from all of the coal fields in the UK. That means if we find archaeological specimens of coal, we can actually say what the age of that coal was. And if we can say what the age of the coal was, we can get a reasonable handle on its location. So we've just done a pilot study, a little proof of concept, and we've tested some coals from Vindolanda, from Housesteads, and from South Shields Fort. And we can say with good confidence that the forts along the wall were exploiting small, local, older coal seams. They're called the Murian seams, and not the Westphalian seams from the Northumberland and Durham coalfield further east. And given that coal was probably transported to the south, there's evidence of coal usage in a lot of places, not just for warmth, but for bathhouses and smelting and many other things. It should be possible. A good PhD or a good research project would actually be able to look at examples of coal, samples of coal, and use this technique to decide which coal seam and where it was exported from. Think of the political and social and military narratives that could result. We don't think much about peat as a source of fuel in archaeology. We think of it as a thing that preserves things, whether that be Vindolanda writing tablets or bones or humans or whatever, leather, but we don't think of it as a source of fuel. And yet there isn't a farm here on along the wall that 60 years ago didn't have its own domestic peat digging for cutting turfs. So it was a bit like if you go over to the west coast of Ireland now, you'll see them still turning peat over to burn. That's what it was like along the wall. If we go back further than the Romans, we know that prehistoric people, Neolithic people, were using peat. But we have very, very little evidence of Romans using peat. All we know is that it's the most ubiquitous deposit along, within a couple of kilometers of the wall itself. But but given that it grows at a millimeter a year, we wouldn't expect to find Roman peat cuttings. But what we might expect to find are Roman peat turfs. And indeed, there was one recovered from a well in York. And this year at excavations at a fort called Magna, also known as Cavoren, on the wall, they think they've turned up a peat turf and evidence of burning peat at that fort, which would be a first. It's logical. I mean, for what it's worth, my hometown Carlisle was completely fueled by peat from a peat bog about 7 or 8 kilometres to the northeast of Carlisle, cut for several hundred years to keep Carlisle people warm. Another bulk mineral is clay, whether that be for ceramics like mortaria or cooking and utensils, or it be for tiles. And the picture in the middle is a roof tile that is in Tully House Museum in Carlisle. It's nicely stamped by the famous Legion of the Ninth. But 25 Roman kilns were found beside the road at a place called Scalescuff, which is 7 kilometres south of Carlisle. And many tiles have been found in Carlisle. And what's intriguing about these tiles is that those kilns and presumably the clay workings were exploiting a particularly special form of clay. It's like those ones that caused the problem with the collapse of the wall. This is a stone-free laminated glacial clay. And the little black and white picture of the guys working it in the Victorian era are working the same deposit for producing tiles and bricks. And so were the Romans, they were using the material from Scalescuff, but how many other little clay workings were they operating? We're pretty lucky in the north to have a diverse geology, and with the diverse geology comes a lot of different minerals and resources and exploits. And one of the things that is still produced here is gypsum at Kirby Thor on the A66. But there used to be a lot more gypsum mines in Cumbria. There were ones near Whitehaven, and there were a couple to the north of Kirby Thor, so Cock Lakes and Coat Hill, and they were working 20 feet, 6 meter themes of gypsum, calcium sulfate, and you probably know it as something that, it's in your toothpaste, but it's also used most commonly as plasterboard. But in the museum, in the Yorkshire Museum in York, you'll find they have several Roman, probably high status burials that are not only shrouded in cloth, but then they had either liquid gypsum or liquid plaster Paris. Plaster Paris is just gypsum that's been heated and then dried, and then when you put water on it, as you probably know from your childhoods when you were making those little plaster Paris models, it sets quite quickly. So did the Romans exploit it? We just don't know. We know that prehistoric people exploited it, because if you are aware of a place called Thornborough Henges, just to the east of the A1 near Massam, then prehistoric people put gypsum chippings on the sides of their ramparts on those henges. and they've seeped into the ground, and we can pick the gypsum up now. But we don't know if the Romans used gypsum here. We know they used it elsewhere, so a form of gypsum called selenite, and in Pompeii and alabaster for their vases, but we don't know about gypsum. You might have heard of this because they're excavating near Eden Bridges in Carlisle on the Eden River crossing, and they at first thought they were dealing with a bathhouse, and now they think they're dealing with a much larger building, a mansio, of which had changing purposes through time. But in the drains, they started to come across intaglios, little semi-precious ring insets, signature ring insets, if you like. They're all reverse inscribed with little symbols on them, and they're jaspers and cornelians. We geologists just call them all chalcedony. We don't really have that fine distinction in terms of they're just silica to us, I guess. But the question I asked the specialist archaeologist, the intaglio specialist, was a guy called the Reverend Martin Hennig from Oxford, is where do they come from, these these stones? And the answer is we don't know. They could be imported from somewhere around the Mediterranean or further east. But if you went up into the Cheviots or southern Scotland, you can go and collect thumbnail size, and some of these things are only 3 millimeters across. Some of them are about 15 mil. You could collect stones as big as that, jaspers and agates, in the streams of the Cheviot or in the streams that drain parts of southern Scotland. And that's because the origin of these particular stones is they're bits of silica that have crystallized out in holes in volcanic rock, and then millions of years as erosion has released them and they've gone into the streams. So were people at the Roman fort in Chew Green dipping into the beck of the Coquet and collecting these things up, because they're now in Carlisle, they're up to 70, maybe even 80 of these stones, including blanks, I believe. So they're now considering that there's a workshop, a school, the Carlisle School. I did ask Professor Hennig if, as we don't know what they are, would it be possible for me to use one for geochemical testing? And he said, well, what will you do with it? And I said, drill a small, and he stopped me there and said no. So it hasn't gone any further yet. So here's a summary, and I hope this works. I really have no idea whether you've heard me, but I just assumed Mike would tell me if you hadn't. So it's a long list. I'm just a geologist. There are a lot of archaeologists in here who validated what I did.
I'll wait for the list to stop scrolling.
Well, I thank you very much. I hope you heard all that. That talk was abstracted from the book that's in the middle of this screen, The Rocks at the Edge of the Empire, and its proceeds go to charity, and you can buy it on Amazon or you can buy it direct from the distributor. But thank you very much. Thanks for listening. I hope you got it all. I haven't a clue whether you did.
Yeah, I think it came over fine in the end, Ian. Sorry for butting in before you'd actually finished. I thought you'd finished. My mistake. um, yeah, I didn't see any other comments on the chat apart from when you leaned forward, the top of your head disappeared off the top of the screen.
I'm not sure you're missing much.
We have some questions. I suspect there's going to be quite a lot, but there's quite a few already. Normally we have to wait a few minutes. Well, not today. From Liz B, if you don't mind me just going straight in, because I think there's going to be a few. Did the Romans actively use igneous or other geological features to define boundaries anywhere else in the Roman Empire? So I suppose she's meaning in the same way they used the windsill.
Um, that's a great question, and I don't know. But David Breeze, who you will know, is trying to persuade me to find that out. And I've got the geological connections, so he's helping me with the archaeological um, connections and background. And when I have some free time, that's my next challenge. Sorry, I'll
Yeah,
take the top of my head off.
there we go. Look forward to hearing the results of that in due course. No doubt that'll be part of one of David's half a dozen books next year because he seems to do that every year. Doesn't he? From John Savin, surely the vallum at Limestone Corner is fully dug. The ditch is unfinished. Maybe because the plan changed. Brackets fort decision.
Yeah, as I said, it wasn't the vallum; it was the four wall ditch that they didn't complete and they left a 3 or 4 ton bit of windsill still in it. They dug
Yeah.
the vallum. They dug the vallum there, but my argument is they didn't dig it elsewhere.
Somebody's asked, what is the name of your book? I think they'll have got it on the screen, but just to repeat,
The rocks at the edge of the empire.
I want to make sure you get as many sales as possible.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's very
um,
hard with all of these silent people.
um, another one from John Savin. The wall in the western section was built in stone um, on return after the Antonine adventure. Um, so, oh, it's a comment, not a question. So, Roman army perfectly capable of building this and did. Yeah, I can't see a question. Can you?
Well, if I can just put him right, the
Okay.
the 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 archaeologists argue about when the conversion from turf to stone started, and some say it started at it started during Hadrian's reign, but initially was um, the wall was built of earth and turf, and then
Yes.
subsequently converted to stone. But the date at which that conversion started is still debated.
I think that's a fair answer from my limited knowledge of the wall. From Sue Harris, would they have imported finished metal goods rather than producing metal locally?
That's entirely possible. What we have evidence of is an awful lot of smithing, but smithing is not the same as smelting. The bits of evidence, there is a fort over near Lanchester where the Reverend Hodgson in the mid 19th century, I might have got the dates wrong, describes several thousand tons of slag, iron slag. And if you know Lanchester, you'll know it has both coal and siderite ores, carboniferous ores. So again, we don't know. Did they import the weapons? Possibly, and I guess it would be good to be able to pin some of these down, which is why the book poses those questions. They're they're open questions as far as I can see.
Mm. Possibly ones we'll never be able to answer, I suspect.
I think, well, if I take issue, I think if instead of focusing quite so much on the sociological, there was some investing in the geological, then we might get closer.
Possibly. From Liz B. Mining is, by its very nature, destructive. Would evidence of Roman mining activities not have been destroyed by post-Roman mining activities? I think you actually touched on that.
The answer is yes. And it's in rare occasions that you find things that are that indicate that there was earlier mining. So there are, I believe, implements in the mines in Cheshire, in Alderley Edge, and the copper mines, and there are implements and evidence in the mines at Great Orme. And I did find, but it's not a reliable reference to two. It is not Roman, but two things that were called celts, which is stone axes found in a mine, an an iron mine in southwest Cumbria. So, but they're few and far between.
Mm. I'm going to press on fairly quickly through these because this is still email one and there's three more already. Just to warn you, I hope you didn't expect an early bed tonight.
I'm fine, thank you.
I don't know who this is from, so this is from Anonymous. Could the Romans have used the iron bands at Brunton, just south of Chollerford?
Yes, I the the richness of iron isn't a very romantic deposit. It's just taken for granted as a rule. But if you, for those of you who know the Carboniferous, these sideritic ores, iron carbonates, are are pretty ubiquitous in the Carboniferous sequence. So, for instance, just north, I could do this by pubs. Just north of the Mile Castle Inn is an 18th, 19th century ironstone working, which used to supply ore to two blast furnaces in Haltwhistle. Not many people know that Haltwhistle had a steel producing industry. The Carboniferous ironstones up at Bellingham, which were operating in the blast furnaces were operating in the 18th century, were producing iron that built some of the iron structures in Newcastle. The iron workings in the Derwent Valley were producing blades and fine iron in the 17th and 18th centuries. And as little as 30 years ago, I remember driving past Concert all the time when the blast furnaces were still going. And initially, those industries started on local iron ores, but ultimately went for ores that were coming from near Middlesbrough, just to the south of Middlesbrough, and then eventually importing Swedish ore or from other places in the world.
Moving away from iron, did the Romans use marl as a source of lime?
I don't know. I don't understand. Marl is a difficult term for geologists because it has no. It's avoided. It's a bit like shale. We don't use it because it has no formal definition.
Mm. Okay. Moving away from Hadrian's Wall, again, anonymous. I live next to Verulamium and we are on clay stroke chalk, all with embedded flint. I'm guessing that a single quarry could have provided at varying depths all the materials for building flints, clay, and chalk for mortar. More an observation around the question, I think. But,
But it's a great observation because what tends to happen with with mineral exploitation, especially bulk mineral exploitation, is the techniques in the hole in the ground are very similar regardless. And if you're there's a place near Brampton called Holbank Gate, which somebody would be familiar with. But there's a set of enormous quarries there. Initially, they started on limestone, but to get to the limestone, they had to go through a mudstone, a shale. And the shale they found they could grind up and make bricks with it. So they worked the limestone and then they worked the shale for bricks. But they also discovered that there was sandstone nearby, and instead of building all the buildings of sand of of bricks, they built their lime kilns using the sandstone. So the techniques are no different, and the people at the time had the skills, and they probably put in the transport networks to exploit it. So I think that question is points to, you know, a high degree of pragmatism. If you've got the resources there and they're heavy to move, and you've got the skills, use them.
Yes, and the Roman army were certainly very good at using things locally. I mean, one of the diagnostic features of a Roman road is very often the quarry pits by the side of it, right by the side of it, so they didn't have to move the materials needed very far. I see no reason why they wouldn't have exploited anything that was available. They
Yep.
may just not have left necessarily evidence behind. Adding to the previous comment, Liz B added that there's also sand not far away in Leighton Buzzard.
Yeah.
Bill
Yeah.
Free asks, what about glass? Any geoprovenancing studies on sand?
None, and I was quite disappointed that everything I read and pointed that pointed to the fact that they imported glass
Mm,
and then they recycled it. So higher, I know we produce some glass sands now in Britain, but it seems that the Romans were favorably disposed to production of glass sand elsewhere and glass elsewhere and imported it. But that's as deep as my research got.
mm. Yeah, I think certainly everything I've read points to that. There was glass working in Castleford, in West Yorkshire. But from what I've read on that, I think it was imported glass and recycled, just as you said.
Yeah, if I could go back to your point about them opening up pits beside the roads, that's exactly what they did to the sandstone for the average wall Lego brick. You know, the common, not the monumental stones, not the lintels or the coins or anything like that, but the standard stone for the wall was produced from small quarries, maybe thousands of them, along the wall. So they minimized transport to the extent possible. They even had a specification, because you know Roman stone better than me. They don't have to be exact. They simply, most of them preferred to be heavy enough for a single man to carry, so they don't have to double handle. Secondly, they're rectangular or cubic on their front face. They're usually trapezoidal, so they're narrower at the back than the front. And that was the spec. It wasn't the
Mm,
specific brick spec. So you can imagine them just churning these things out at small quarries up and down the wall and moving them to the wall, and then, you know, the builders would be well versed in putting those together.
mhm. Yeah, makes sense to me. Moving on to the Carlisle intaglios. Vicky Harley has asked if anybody has done, she says, X-ray analysis, so XRF, I'm assuming she's referring to, which is a non-destructive method.
Um, to my knowledge, they haven't, but I don't have a formal connection with the excavation. I know the archaeologist Frank Giaco very well, and I spoke to Martin Hennig about them. Um, but I would qualify that I'm not sure that that would produce a sufficiently, it wouldn't be able to discriminate
Mm,
well. And the other issue we have is, even if we use the most sophisticated isotopic strontium isotope work to look at these things and determine their atomic makeup,
mm,
we have an enormous problem, and that is that there is no database of chalcedonic silica, of intaglios, of semi-precious stones from that period or anywhere else. So that leaves you with, so you have a very good and detailed analysis of your ring stone, but then the only way you can say where it's from is by one-to-one comparisons across Europe, which
Mm.
is a pretty time consuming. So the only reason people can have good genetic results nowadays is that there is a growing and comprehensive DNA database. And I mentioned the one that exists for coal spores. If British Coal and NCB before it hadn't done that, then the ability of the guy I used just a couple of months ago to analyze coals from Vindelander and Housteds was instantly able to compare them with a series of type spores that exists and is published.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you would be it would almost be a Sisyphean
Yeah.
task. And
Yeah.
one of the issues, one of the crossover issues between geology and archaeology is that if I produced a paper on something like this and didn't have a statistically relevant sample size, it wouldn't be well received in science. Five points, 10 points, 20 points doesn't make a summer.
No.
So
No. Right. Questions are thinning out now. So if anybody wants to ask another one, please put it into the chat and Rob will send it on to me. A question from Margaret Williams. Did the Romans have a word for peat?
yes. Oh, should I say no? Take that down. The Roman word for charcoal and the Roman word for coal are the same, carbo.
Mm.
I
But
don't know, and I think they might have had a word for peat, but I think it might be like turf or turbo or something close to the German. But yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure. I can't help you there, I'm afraid. Um,
Turbo. I've just read it.
ah,
Thank you, Tim.
yeah, I was very interested about what you had to say about peat. I always think of that in botanical terms and not geological. Um, but yeah, I suppose it is really, isn't it? Um, peat's fascinating. But what interests me is how little work has been done on the fuel supply for the Roman army. Very little. And I've tried to research this because I have a bit of a theory about the Cam High Road. For those who don't, long straight road that climbs from the fort at Bainbridge out of Wensleydale and heads west and is supposed to keep on going to past Ingleborough. But you can get it to the top of the hill, and then there's no trace of anything Roman whatsoever. And I have a bit of a theory about this because where it stops is precisely where, in the 19th century, there was a turbary field.
Mm.
In other words, where the village of Bainbury got all its fuel supply from. Um, and for me, it would make absolute sense that that's actually the purpose for the road. It's to bring the turf down off the moor. Can't prove it though, and probably never will, unless somebody digs up a nice Roman wooden spade that's got itself buried in the peat. We can live and hope.
Mike, just I've been reading things popping up, but one of the one of the issues, the reason the list of people who helped me was so long was that frequently I started my search as a retired man, um, not in an academic institution, mostly on web searches. But then I went and looked at not just magazines or articles or books, but went into first level papers and academic literature. And frequently, even with AI, the results it's produced should be queried with as much caution as AI should be. And I found myself having to cold call or warm call if I knew them some of the people who are expert in these fields in archaeology, whether that be a guy called David Dungworth about metallurgy, or David Breeze about the course of the wall, or Andy Burley about Vindolanda. And so I sometimes the answer came back, well, that's really not a question we ask ourselves, because we are
Mm,
more concerned often with the social. So I can appreciate that the web may well produce things that look like an answer, but I would say trace it back a bit and go back to the primary paper source. And frequently you're having to go back into quite old literature.
mhm.
And the and I know for a start that geology's moved on a lot since then. So I if I had any hopes, desires to produce a paper that gave the answers to a lot of these questions about where the provenance of things were, it was pretty quickly smashed. And the book came out as a list of questions rather than a list of answers. But I still thought it was worth raising the questions. So yeah, there it is.
Mm. We have more from Albert, our treasurer. Um, he's been doing some work with the Brigstock Archaeological Society. No, it's not just near Corby, so Northamptonshire. Um, and apparently, they found quite a lot of slag with a lot of Roman pottery from a small area, some 2 miles south of Corby, which of course is a major iron extraction and working area. Would it be possible to date the slag or analyze it if it was of the Roman period or modern? Sorry, that wasn't. I didn't word that very well.
I think in terms of its contextual dating, in the location, I just don't know the context of the site, so I don't know. In terms of its geochemistry, I think sometimes what guides the analysis are the type and extent of impurities in the slag. But if you were to look for uniqueness in its geochemistry, I think you would find that that was very difficult to discriminate.
Mm,
It's like the question that's often raised about lead and the use of isotope work in lead, and saying that we've done isotopic analysis and there's a cluster of results that show this came from, I don't know, the Bristol area or the South Pennines or the Lake District. And people who are far more knowledgeable than me about mineralogy and vein minerals, veins, will tell you that you can have as much geochemical variation across one mineral vein than you can across the whole district. So and and the other thing about metals is that they could often be the product of the combination of ore from a number of sources, which may or may not have gangue minerals in them. So that's minerals that are not they're not metal minerals that you want. All of those can contaminate and confuse the result. And with lead in particular, it's eminently reusable. So just because a slingshot bullet from Burns Walk or Ambleside has a particular isotopic signature, how do you know that the guy didn't make it out of a coffin that he found down the road that wasn't a pipe that was used before? So it's incredibly difficult, and usually the numbers of isotopic results that are produced don't conform to the statistical strictures or that would please many hardened geochemists.
mm.
And you've got to remember in the end, when they've got that isotopic result that says this is the signature or fingerprint of the lead, this is where it came from. When they're comparing it where it came from, that piece of context is the geological mapping that people like I used to do. And that's an interpretation in itself. If you go on the British Geological Survey webpage and plug in something like lead and isotopes, you will see that there's a map of of trying to be helpful about what different varieties of lead isotopes are. And it basically comes to the conclusion is that we can tell the difference between Scottish lead and English lead with no more differentiation than that.
There must be some way of identifying Yorkshire lead.
Yeah, it's heavier and it's heavier and more expensive.
Of course.
Yeah.
A comment rather than a question from Dylan Matthews down in Devon. A quick online search shows that helpfully there is some new PhD research going on out there on the uses of coal by Romans, and he's quoted the title here. I don't know if you're familiar with it. The use of coal for ferrous metallurgy in Roman Britain, um, by E. Leduc
Oh, yeah,
at
I
the
know
University
Elizabeth.
of Cambridge.
Yeah, yeah, we she was in that list of people who helped.
Ah, so you're aware of it all. Good,
Yeah, yeah,
good.
we she's finished her PhD now. So, yeah, we did correspond, but from memory, she was coming to some of the same conclusions in general about mineral and bulk and metal mineral provincing
Mm,
that I know it's not very positive, but it is real that the geological world is not is complex and it's not tied down. It is
mhm,
don't it's what we know is an interpretation of the facts that we have.
mm,
So to give you an example of that, as you're a Roman Roads Association, you'll all know the Western Bypass in Newcastle that it goes from crosses the Tyne and then goes through Kenton. I was the mapper who did the Kenton part of the west of Newcastle before that bypass went through. Once they done the boreholes and dug the cutting and exposed the batters, my map was in error because I didn't have that information. But as soon as it became available, then sometimes my line work was 10, 20, 50 meters out because I
mm.
had to depend on available evidence. So
Yeah.
I think that's always worth remembering that I, I guess most of you regard an ordnance survey map as relatively precise and high resolution, but geological maps you should ask what the evidence is for their lines, and if you see long straight lines or a line that's got a curve that looks elegant rather than wiggly or corrugated, you should start to be
Mhm.
circumspect about it.
Um, Delrin actually went on to mention that a thesis um, shows that the Romans specifically used coal for blacksmithing.
Yes,
Uh,
yes,
so
yeah.
ironworking. And then he says, "What a fantastic talk." So,
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't mean it to be in any way depressing or negative. The positive is that there's an incredible amount we don't know, which is an opportunity for an awful lot of good work.
yes.
And I would hope that good work takes place with geologists and archaeologists as partners, not as any way subcontracted in either realm, because
Mm,
it's the specification of the project that's going to make the difference.
mm. I'd certainly like to see more work done on specific use of materials in road construction. Big surprise there. Yes, we know that the Roman army particularly tended to use very local materials, but the Roman army didn't build all the roads in Britain. They built most of those in the north and in the west, But certainly in the south and east, that's not actually true, and we don't think it is anymore anyway. But there's been very little work um, done to see where the materials did come from. There's one example actually in Yorkshire, so it's still in the north, but possibly after the army built the original version. That's near Pontefract. I gave a talk in Pontefract where I was telling everybody that the materials were local, only to be told that they'd actually proved that the limestone came from a quarry 5 miles away. So that's just a little example.
Mm.
But clearly, you can't just tar everything with the same brush.
No.
There will be differences, and they will have had preferences for particular materials in particular circumstances, I'm sure. But nobody's ever really studied it, not in this country, as far as I'm aware, anyway.
Well, I mean, if you go back to coal and the little pilot study we've just done, the reason that it was instigated was that several of us, archaeologists and geologists, felt that intuitively the Romans would exploit local coal resources.
Yes.
By that I mean older coals called Namurian coals from around down the Tyne Valley. So for those of you who know the area, places like Haydenbridge, Barden Mill, Haltwhistle, Alston, Acomb were all mining a coal called the Little Limestone coal, which is much older than the coals in the Northumberland and Durham coalfield.
Mm-hmm.
But the only piece of research that was done in the mid 90s by a guy called Smith and a lady called Butterworth had taken a couple of samples and said no, the coals at Vindolander and Housesteads had come from Ebchester, or in other words, West Durham, which seemed to us to be why would they bring coal 38
Mm-hmm.
kilometers? I mean, you don't, it's not a mineral that you reduce in volume to use. Why would they do that when they had perfectly good um, heat generating coals, steam coals on their doorstep? So that's why we did the little
Mm.
piece of research, and we're currently preparing the paper. But the answer is that it seems they did use local coals in the samples that we did. Admittedly, there are only 8 samples, so that's hardly a statistically relevant sample. But the the issue is they could have used both at different times. And
Mm.
it's equally possible that you had a quartermaster who had a backhander relationship with a contractor in southwest Durham, and or the pack horses needed a return load, or whatever, So it's intriguing, and as is the fact that it seems that there was trade or carriage of coal from the Tyne
Wait, go in your bed.
south.
Bed. Bed.
Um, Chris Wood, can you turn your mic off, please, Chris? Or can someone on the staff do it? Can you still hear me, Ian?
I can, yeah. Sorry,
Yes.
I think I finished.
Okay, I'm thrown now. I was going to ask you something. It's gone completely out of my head. It'll come back to me, no doubt, after we've done.
Well, Mike, while you're thinking, it happens to me all the time. You said something before about Romans didn't build all the roads.
Well, the army didn't.
Yeah, the army didn't build
Yeah,
all the roads.
yeah.
Yeah, and for reasons that are probably best known to a man who's got too old, I did Romans before I researched and wrote a book on geology's relationship with prehistoric societies in the north as well, which you might have seen as a book, and that came out last November. So it was the prequel, and logic said I should have done it first, but I didn't. But the one thing that I really enjoyed in researching the prehistoric book was just how much evidence there was of use of almost every one of the materials that I've talked to you about by prehistoric people.
Yes.
Even though I hadn't heard about it, Iron Age people are using lead. And it's logical because they used copper. And when they mined copper, in veins that have copper, they usually have some lead in as well. But they used lead in order to im- improve the precision or the quality of their molds. So I think what I got the sense of was how much Romans. You ask the average visitor on the wall. I live near the Twice Brood, so, and I do walks and talks for National Trust and the National Park and stuff. And you speak to the average visitor on the wall, and the assumption is by most of them, the Romans came in and they were the ones who invented everything. And you say, but no, this was a managed landscape.
Mm.
Long before the Romans came here, even the vegetation cover, the environment was closer to that which we have today than closed canopy woodland. Uh, so I think the thing that made me smile really was just the extent of the contribution of what you might call the indigenous people. Um, and ultimately how Rome is a name, not Romans are what they did, not where they came from, because most of them up here were auxiliaries from across the empire, and ultimately, by the time they had children, they were mostly half Brits in any case. So
Mm. Yes, there's a lot I could add from that. I have a prehistorian in the room next door, and the so many of the materials you've talked about tonight uh, do turn up on some of the sites that she's been looking at recently. So you're quite
when
right.
when's her
Things move amazing distances as well, but that's another
when's her birthday, Mike?
thing. Why?
Well, that book about prehistory and rocks, it would make an excellent present.
I should have seen that one coming. Yeah, she's listening, so I've got to be careful what I say.
For £12, you can't be from Yorkshire.
I should let slip she was born in Essex. I'm dead now. Uh, there are no more questions. That does appear to be it. So we've finished almost dead on the hour and a half you allowed. 4 minutes over. That's anyhow. Um, yeah, so brilliant. So thank you very much. You're getting a lot of applause. I'm sure you can see it coming up on your screen.
Thank you, everybody. And how can you tell me how many of you there were? Because I find it really weird to speak to an audience I can't see or even number.
Dave usually takes the number. I know it reached 300, but I'm not sure how
Three-
far over that.
310, I
Thank
think
you
was the
very.
max.
That's really really appreciated. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, we have a good audience, and it's not the same people every time. Um,
If it was
we have.
daylight, if it was daylight, Mike, I could turn my screen round and you could look at the stain gate if you wanted.
You're just showing off now.
It's dark and wet. Yeah.
Yes, we've got a road 2 miles down the road, but not through our back garden, unfortunately. But there you go. You can't have everything.
You, you're,
Right.
more, you're more than welcome to come and dig it up. I'd love it.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we might just take you up on that one of these days. I mean, the road has been sectioned in various places, but I don't know whether it's actually been done there. Dave Armstrong will know far better than me. We will talk about that in future, and I'll need to talk to you about peat as well because I'm writing a paper on that idea of mine. I've been writing it for 2 years and have got nowhere because, as you mentioned, sometimes the information you need is very hard to find, if indeed anybody's looked at it. Right, let's call it a night. So thank you everybody for attending, those who are still with us, and thank you especially to those who made a donation to help us cover costs of putting all these talks on. Zoom doesn't come cheap when you have big audiences. We are going to be experimenting. I've mentioned this before. Well, I might probably take the plunge for the next one with using a webinar rather than bog standard Zoom, which should just give us a little more slickness and control. But we'll see how that works out. So everybody be ready for that one. And with that, it just remains me to thank the backroom team, which tonight were Dave, Jeff, and who else do we have? Rob. Yes. Sorry, Rob, I couldn't remember you were there then. Who did the questions? And Susan will be back doing those for the next talk. And that's it. So thank you again, Ian. We usually log out and then log back in again for just a few minutes to have a sort of a post-mortem afterwards, if you're all right with that, or you're rushing off.
No, I think my wife's deserted me, so I'm here.
Oh, fair enough. So we'll close the meeting down, and we'll see you again in a few minutes. And good night to everybody. Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.